Alright, so today I would like to go over the Diesel tutorial, mainly because I was having issues with it, and I went through the tutorial using a different database than the one they designed it for, which is Postgres. I use Sqlite, and I think showing people how I went about doing that might be useful. Let's get it. Alright, so in terms of starting, we should probably figure out what Diesel is, define that. So here's the crates.io page for it. Diesel is a safe, extensible ORM and query builder for Rust. So there's a lot of words in there, and the acronym ORM is probably the one we need to define most. So what is an ORM? And I went to Wikipedia, and they have a lot of words here, but I'm going to just summarize it in my own words. An ORM is a abstraction layer over databases such that you write code in the language of your choosing and through their wrapper, and their wrapper will write the SQL for you. So here's an example of that, just in terms of the Wikipedia article, where they have the original SQL statement, which is here, right? And then they have the context, raw SQL, get the list, and they get the first name. If you were using an ORM and they have their API, you can use something along the lines of get person passing the ID, which is the ID here, and then you already have your person object, and then you can just get the first name and you're done. And this call will write the SQL for you. And one of the benefits of this is that you could use the same logic, like the code lines, regardless of which database backend you're using, as long as the ORM that you're using supports that database. So going back to Diesel, this means that for Diesel and its supported databases, we should be able to write Rust code that will in turn write our SQL code for us and allow us to interact with the database. So I did note the backends, supported backends or supported databases. And if you go to the Diesel GitHub page, scroll down right about here, it says that the supported databases are Postgres, MySQL, and Sqlite. And in terms of figuring out which one you're going to use or configuring your project to use them, you have the Diesel version, and then in features, you could just sort of pick the database, seemingly. I'm not sure if you can use the full string. You may be able to just have all of them if you wanted to, but I was just going to pick Sqlite. Alright, so the Getting Started guide. If you come to this page, which there are many ways of getting here, let me make this a little bit bigger. This is the intro tutorial to learn how to use Diesel. And it's going over a CRUD app where you're making a blog post. We can make a post, we'll create a post, publish a post, and then you can show your published post. And the thing I was having issues with, so we're going to go through this all, but the things I was having issues with was here, installing the Diesel CLI. And they note here that you may get an error like this, which means that you have to install the MySQL client because it needs the shared object files in order for it to bind properly and have access to it. And you might get other issues where you don't have the Postgres shared object files in the right place or at the right version. I kept running into issues like that, and I know that on my machine I have used Sqlite, I can use Sqlite, and Sqlite is a supported database. So I wanted to go through the tutorial using Sqlite. And that's what we're going to do today. So let me take some time to create a new directory. Alright, so I've created my new directory, or my new project, and you can see here it just has the start stuff that you would normally see, ls, source, and I believe when we create a lib we can do something like cargo test just to make sure everything is running properly. Cool, we see that it's working. So next they want us to modify the cargo.toml file, And here they have Postgres, but for us, we're going to use Sqlite, so we have to modify that. So that's the first thing to change. Alright, so I've copied the code over. As you can see, we have Diesel. I'm using the version that they specified here, and for features, I put Sqlite. In terms of other dependencies that we're using .env, which I haven't really used before, but seemingly it allows you to put environment variables that you would normally just instantiate and just have running into a .env folder, and into a .env file, and during your runtime of the application, .env will invoke those so you have access to them. And in terms of this tutorial, I believe they use it for your database URL. So let's move on. So to make sure everything's working, we should run cargo test again, or cargo check. Make sure everything is installed. So while that is going, I can talk a little bit about the cargo install Diesel CLI. Yes, I was having issues installing it, and I'm still having issues installing it. However, I was able to install it with just the SQL feature. And if you scroll down here, they give you instructions on how to do that explicitly for Postgres. However, if you just want SQLite, you just exchange this for SQLite and you should be fine. Alright, so now that that's done, we can move on to the next portion. So before I was telling you about the .env, right? And how you're putting things into a .env file. This is that line. They have echo, and they have a database, which is going to be our environment variable for where the database is located. And here is Postgres. Typically for Postgres, you have the username and password, and then the URL of how to reach it. So we're still going to use a .env file, but that needs to be changed as well. And I'm just going to use a string like testing.db because SQLite can be created anywhere. So vim.env database underscore URL equals, looks like I don't have to have quotations around that, testing db.db. Moving onward. So now they want us to run Diesel setup, right? And you have Diesel setup after you install the Diesel CLI binary. So initially what Diesel setup does is create a connection to the database, seemingly. So our database was created, but also they created migrations, like initial migrations for your application. And in the migrations file, migrations directory, it is currently empty. However, later on, we should have like up and down migrations, which I believe the next command might do that for us. So let's go back here. Okay, one thing I want to note is that the path to the directory is currently relative, and if we were to run Diesel setup in another directory, as in, let's go into source, right? Source does not have a testing underscore db. But if we were to run Diesel setup here, it would create it here. So in terms of modifying this tutorial so that you can use it with SQLite, you have to make sure you run your commands, at least your Diesel commands, from the same directory each time, or the same starting point. So let's remove that. So coming back here, their next thing that they want us to do is Diesel migrations generate create post. Copy paste, and as you can see, migrations were created. There's a timestamp of our date and the name, which is create post, and they're going to give us an up and they're going to give us a down. So if we go to migrations, we look at that directory and we see up and down. Cat up, it is empty. Cat down, it is empty. So in terms of the up and downs, the up is the actions that you want to take on your database, and the down is how you would roll back or undo that up action. So this allows for you to go through your migration step by step or take them away step by step. So here's another thing that we have to go about changing. In the next step, they want us to add explicit SQL for the initial up step for creating our table. And the tables here, the table's called post. It has an ID, title, body, and published. So there's a few things to note here. One, if you recall Sqlite and maybe some of the differences between Sqlite and Postgres, serial is not something that is used, varchar is not something that is used, and Boolean does not exist in Sqlite. So the question is, how would you go about converting this if you had to do it manually? The way I went about doing it is figuring out with a example database. So open DB browser for Sqlite, and then I just created a new database. Not that. Oh, file new in-memory database. And then once I got to new in-memory database, I can call the table post, which is what they have there. And I can start adding the fields as needed. So ID is going to be integer. It's going to be a primary key. It should auto increment, and it should not be null, right? And then I can add another field, title, which is going to be text and not null. Okay. Body, which is also text, not null, and the last field is published, which they have marked as a Boolean. Like I noted earlier, Sqlite doesn't have Booleans, but if you want to represent Booleans, then you should probably do that via integers and using 0 and 1. 0 being false and 1 being true. So leave that as integers and say not null. So this gives us the general idea of what the SQL needs to be that we need to write for that table. This is actually the entire string. Let's see if I can copy it. And I was able to copy it. Cool. Give an extra line. And now let's see if this works. So get rid of that. Oh, the down. For down, they just want us to drop tables. That's synonymous between, from my knowledge, all SQL databases, so that's fine. We don't have to change anything there. Drop table post. So let's try to run this migration, and let's make sure we're in the right location. So testing DB is there. Now Diesel migration run. We have just created our schema for, well, we just created our table for post, and that should be in testing DB. And one way to verify that is just opening it. Open database, documents, GitHub, Diesel, open. And we can see here that post has been created. Everything seems to be working properly. There's also this other table here. underscore diesel schema migrations. I haven't really looked into that, but it's good to know that it's here. Alright. So earlier we mentioned the ability to go up and down in terms of our migrations, meaning that we could create an action or do an action on the database via the up and then revert that action via the down. So there is a redo option, which for redo it does the down and then it does the up to redo the SQL migration. And one of the things they note here is that this is a good way to test that both your up and down migrations are working properly. So let's do that, and seemingly worked fine. So the next place where we have to make some changes, they have a source libs here, and in it we can see that we're explicitly using the PG connection. Since we're not using Postgres, we're going to have to switch that to Sqlite. One thing I realized is that the Sqlite connection is actually included in the prelude, so we in theory don't need to replace this line, we just need to remove it and then change this with the right connector. So let's do that. Alright, so I've finished copying the code over, and this is what it looks like. Like I was saying earlier, the line for the PG connection has been removed because we're using SQLite. SQLite is in the prelude, so this doesn't error out, and you can see that when I save it, and it doesn't yell at me. And for the most part, that was the only thing that needed to be changed in this file. So moving on downward through their tutorial, they want us to create a schema and models file. So just a quick overview of that. The models file is going to be where we write our struct for our models, and more or less in Rust. And then the schema file, which they mention here that it's usually generated by them, but for this tutorial we're writing it out, looks like this. And the schema file uses a macro that allows them to sort of generate what the SQL would be for this schema, or for this struct, I should say. So let's do that. And to note, some things are going to need to be changed in here, because when we create our database, Boolean isn't a thing. So that's an I32, it's a 0 or 1 now. And same thing here, this needs to be changed as well. So let me copy those over and do that, and then we can continue. Alright, so continuing onward, I made the changes. I did the public mod, models, and schema, added that here. And for the models, what they didn't show you is the import. I did the import of prelude, which I believe you need for every file. It's not explicitly stated there, but I think so. And then in terms of derive, I added debug because we're going to need that later on when we print out post. But everything else is more or less the same, with the exception of publish, which we mentioned earlier, which I made into an I32 instead of a Boolean, which they have there. And then one thing that didn't happen the first time I was going through this tutorial that happened this time was that the schema file was actually generated for me. Before I was having a lot of issues going back and forth and modifying it and make sure it was correct. But I didn't have to do any of that this time. So yeah, hopefully this all works out. So moving onward to their next steps. So the next steps, they want us to be able to show post, right? And if we scroll through this thing, we're in bin, so this is an executable for a library, which means we do have to load in our the things that we want to use, the external crates, which is this one with our library, and then Diesel, which is the thing that we're doing the video on. We're gonna load or import the post, the models, import everything we have in demo, and then import the prelude, which I believe we need every single time. And then in main, they have this line here. We do the demo schema post DSL star. So they describe it down here, but more or less this is used to import a lot of shortcut commands that we can use for other things. So they noted down here that because we did this, we can now say post instead of post table, published instead of post published. Again, so it's just shortcuts. Things that need to be changed here. So we establish a connection with the database, which should work. We do a post filter. Post filter is their way of doing a when command. So you can do, this is post filter when published is equal to true, as in it's going to query through all of your posts, and if published is equal to true, or when published is equal to true, they're going to return those for a limit of 5. And they're going to load it as a post and a connection, and then they have the expected error. So the thing that needs to be changed is published is no longer a Boolean. So we're not going to try to check to see if it's true. We're going to check to see if the value is equal to 1. And I'm not sure if this has to be changed at all, but we'll see in a second. So let me write this out and then we'll go through it again. Alright, so I finished copying the code over. We have, like I was saying before, we have the importing of the external crates, which is the crate that we're creating now with our library and Diesel. And then from there, we're just importing everything that we have from this library, but also from our models, and we're importing the prelude. And I already went over the DSL portion. So coming down here, establish connections is a function that we created in the library to create the connection to the database, right? Post.filter. Earlier I said when clause, but really I meant where clause, because you write SQL star or select star from table where, and then you have your Boolean statement like ID equals 1 or publish equals true. Here it's publish equals 1. So this is the where clause. And then we modify publish to check for the equality of it being equal to 1 because it's no longer Boolean. Limit 5, that's what they had there. We have a .load, which seemingly returns all of the objects in a specific format for us, and we're making sure they are post. And then we have an expect in case there are errors. Then we were going through the post that we have returned, and then we're printing them out to screen. Post title, post body, more or less. So that is here, and this, given that this is in your bin, you can run it as a bin command, which they note here. So let's get out of this, and it runs. It says it's not used. It says the prelude is unused import. Meh. But we can see here that it's displaying 0 posts because we currently do not have any posts in our database. So moving onward, they have the model. All right, so let's go through this real quick. Super schema posts. So we want to have access to this, the post schema. And oh, that's something I didn't really mention. Insertable. And up here, if we scroll back to post, right, they had queryable. So these are things that I guess traits, they should be traits associated with Diesel that allow you to either query an object from the database or insert objects into databases. Like they can sort of control that mechanism. So posts are queryable, and that's why they have this here. And if you're creating a new post, then it is insertable, as in you can insert this into the database. And then here they denote where it's going to be inserted. So table name post. and this is just a struct with a title and body. So let me copy that over real quick. Alright, so I've copied that code over. We can see it here, added to what was already in our models file. I added the prelude at this line, and then I added the new post down here. For this portion, nothing needs to change. Scrolling down, in our library, we want to add the ability to create a post. And let's go through this real quick. So in our models, we're going to import post and new post, which is the two things that we just created. In terms of the connection, that will have to be changed. Title and body, and here it's returning a post, which we're going to try to have to finagle. The reason why we're going to try to have to finagle that is because scrolling down, schema post, just so we can have access to that, new post, right down here. So this get value, this is going to return an error because it relies on, I believe, a trait that is only implemented for Postgres. I'll write it out so that we can see this error, and then I can show you in the source code, or at least in the documentation where it's explained. But yes, let's do that right now. Alright, so I've copied the information over, and we can see that we have a red mark, which is denoting an error. And this error is stating that the trait bound Diesel Sqlite Diesel backend, the supports returning clause is not satisfied, and that is a requirement for, at least for us to use get result. And for a little bit more clarity on that, so if we go here, right, this is the Diesel documentation. I did a search for supports returning clause, and the only implementer of that is PG, which is Postgres. So if you want to try to go through this tutorial with a database that is not Postgres, then you need to figure out a workaround for at least this portion. And I did try one thing earlier, but I want to try one more thing, and then once I'm done with that, I will go over what my workaround was. Alright, so I took some time to try to figure out how to rewrite it. Let me make my code bigger so we can see it and go through it real quick. So for the create post, one of the major issues that I was having is that the get results seemingly does not work for Sqlite, and as such, getting access to the last item you inserted into the database seems kind of tricky, and I haven't figured that out yet. So I think the best thing I can do at the moment is try to print out the results that I can try to search for the result that I just put into the database via a query and then print it out. So that comes into, at this point in time, right here. So I replace get result with execute. And if you go to the documentation, real quick. I think that's, here it is, with execute. So I replaced get result with execute. And execute is usually used in conjunction with insert into, update, delete. This seemingly is, quote unquote, the underlying mechanism probably used in get results. I'm not positive on that. One thing they do note here is that if you're trying to load data from a database, you should use load instead. But yeah, we can exchange get result for execute in this scenario. Come back over here. So we pass in our connection, and then this is going to be inserted into the database. And then my sort of workaround, which I don't know how valid this is, but it's something, is doing post.table and then doing a filter. Filter is our where clause. So earlier we noted that the schema post DSL star imported a lot of shortcuts for us. Here we did not do that. Here we just have schema post. So in order to get access to the shortcuts that we were using before, I did the long route. Post, DSL, title, like, to do a like clause. And I'm formatting the string that I'm going to do the like clause with and I'm just going to search for the new post.title. And hopefully if your titles are relatively unique, then you should only get one. I'm going to load that. So load is something that we wrote earlier but haven't really seen used yet. Hopefully I'll be able to load the results into an array and have them as posts. And then down here I want to print out those results because ultimately, at least for this tutorial, we need to know the ID associated with the post in order to publish it and do other things with it. So that's how I modified the code. So let's move on, continue with the tutorial. Alright, so the next step that they're going to have us do is write post. So in our bin, we're going to create an executable that allows us to create a post or to write a post. More or less, we have the external crates. The only thing that's really new here is that we're importing standard IO, standard in read, and we're using that in order to capture input from our terminal and save that. So this is how it works. We create a connection, make a connection to the database, ask the user what the title is going to be, create a placeholder that's going to store said title, and then do standard in read line, and then have the user enter in the title. And then this line seemingly is just copying over the title or rewriting it so that we cut off the new line, because there's going to be new lines added after everything in the terminal. And then coming down here, they're continuing onward. You can't see the full string, but it is more or less telling us to write the content of the post. The title, which we just saved, is going to be printed out there, and EOF. So EOF they have at the bottom here. They have it under configurations. More or less, this is the command to end or to end user input. And on non-Windows systems, you can do Control D, and seemingly on Windows systems, you can do Control Z. So they just have that as a static lifetime, so it's always in the binary. You always have access to it. But yeah, they're using that for this string. And then we're repeating the process by creating a mutable body. It's a string, going to be a placeholder. Doing the standard in thing again. We're doing read to string and mutable body, and everything you type is going to go, once you stop typing and do the Control D or Control Z, that's going to be saved to body, and then we're going to call our create post, pass the connection, title, and body, and then save the draft. So one thing we won't be able to do is, here they have the post returned and then they print it out. Given that I couldn't really figure out how to return the post properly, I'm just printing it out within the create post. And I don't think we really need this line at all. So I'm going to copy over that and let's see how it goes. Alright, so I've copied the code over. Let me make it bigger so we can see it. And it's more or less the same with the exception of down here, create post, where I'm not returning anything. And I kind of just let it rock there. So I ran this as a test trial, and I did run into an issue. So if we do right now, cargo run, bin, write post, right? We get asked what our title is, which is expected, and let's call it testing 1. And then we get asked to write the body for it. Hello world, Control D. And then I get a panic. My panic states that I have a database error, and because I have a not null constraint on published, which is something that's not included in the original tutorial. I just put that on willy-nilly earlier in the video. So that means I have to change the create post function so that it passes in a default published value. So I'm going to do that real quick. Alright, so I just made the correction, and that is in 2 places. So if we go to source.models, 1, the new post struct needs to have a published field, and I just copied the pattern that they're using with the other ones. And then outside of that, a change needs to happen in source libs in the create post. So in the create post, I changed it so that it's always passing in a 0 as a reference. And those errors, if you care about them, are just stating that this can be changed to shorthand, given that title is going to be equal to title and body is going to be equal to body. But meh. And then what is that? Once that is done, we can now write a post. And I've tried this one, so call this one testing 2. And this is going to be stuff. And then I'm going to do Control D to exit out of it, and we can see that our post is printed. ID is 2, title is testing, body is stuff, and publish equals 0. Cool. So then moving onward, we already wrote show post, right? I think that happened already. Yeah, show post. So currently we can run show post. However, it shouldn't show us anything because show post only shows when publish is equal to 1, or true in our case, or true in their case, 1 in our case. And as such, it should still just print 0 because we haven't published anything. And to demonstrate that, show post, still displaying 0 posts, right? So the next part of the tutorial, I believe, is to change a post to publish. And that is right here. And let's go through that real quick. Put that over here, make this bigger. So this isn't much code. It's same stuff at the beginning, prelude demo, post. It takes in an environment args. That's really the only difference here. So in main, we're going to import the shorthand helper functions for post and publish. We see here for the ID, we're taking that as an argument passed into the application. So args and the first argument, which is the first passed in argument, 0 is always the name of the application. And we're going to make sure that is an I32. We're going to establish a connection. We're going to pass that ID. Well, we're going to do post.find. So select star from post where ID is equal to whatever you pass in, right? And then we're going to, it's going to be updating. We're going to update that found post to set publish to, we're going to set it to 1. They set it to true. But that's something we changed. And then again, we can't do the get result. So instead, we're just not going to print anything. Just to speed things along, we're going to have to change this to execute. And this, I think we can still print out. So let's write that over real quick. Alright, so I copied the code over. This is what it looks like for the most part. I haven't ran it yet, but we're about to do that shortly. Go through it real quick. So the parts that would change were down here for the execute, right? One thing to note is that when execute runs, it returns the number of rows affected, I believe. So it's just a usize number. And I just have that go to underscore because we can't really use it for anything. And then at the end, I just hit publish because technically speaking, I don't have access to the post, so I can't do post.title. That being said, let's see if this works. And this will be publish post. This post. And there was an error. Let's figure this out. Requires a post ID. Ah, you are right. It does require a post ID. And the error was that I didn't fulfill the requirements for the command line, which state that I need to pass in an argument, and the argument is the post ID. Once I did that with 1, it published. I believe it's idempotent in the sense that if I run it twice, it's not going to do anything different. However, now when I do the show post, it's going to show the posts that are published, and testing 1 hello is now published, and we've just went through the process of changing it from not published to published. So the last thing they have in this tutorial is deleting post, which is more or less the same. Here's where they introduce the like thing that we used earlier for filtering, but outside of that, it's almost identical to publish post. So I'm gonna copy this code over real quick, and then we can walk through it. All right, so I copied the code over, walk through it real quick. Everything in the beginning is more or less the same. That is the same. Import the helper functions. We want an argument for our command line. One thing to note is this argument is going to be a string, because we're going to use down here we use title like pattern. So we're going to try to find the post that we want to delete via the title and not the post ID. One thing to note is that could possibly also delete multiple posts at once. And we're using execute here, which we already went through, passing the connection. That's going to return the number of affected rows in the database, and then we just print that out. So I haven't tried to run this yet, but let's do that now. So delete posts, and that one's called testing one. So let's do delete posts. I can do it as testing one, and it deleted one post. So if we go to try to show the post, we now have 0 posts being displayed because we deleted it. And with that, let me just verify. Delete post, we have got to the end of the tutorial. So that is more or less the end of the video as well. Just to summarize, the reason why I did this is because I was having issues running or going through this tutorial using Postgres, so I wanted to try to do it with Sqlite, which is something I'm more familiar with, and I figured that other people might benefit from that as well. There are a lot of other things you can learn from or learn about Diesel. They have more guides to go through. There's a way to actually generate code. There's a bunch of stuff here that I have no idea about that I'll probably be looking into shortly. But with that said, this is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe. Till next time, peace.